Hello there, and you're welcome once more to another edition of the 3-day weather forecast from the Nigerian Meteorological Agency. I am Onyilo Desmond. Today we want to look at a seasonal phenomenon that plays out over West Africa, the little dry season, which some call the August break. And for this discourse, we'll be zooming in into Ikeja in Lagos State. Now, this bar graph shows us rainfall accumulation, decadal rainfall accumulation, by which we mean accumulated rainfall within 10 days, gives us a decade. So 3 bars shows us rainfall distribution accumulated within a given month. Our months of reference are July, which is highlighted where we have the red line, and August, which is highlighted by the yellow lines. The green shows us where this phenomenon, the little dry season, has actually been established and how it played out. So this graph shows us a time span from March in 2023 up to January, February in 2026. So let's start off from the first year within timeline, which is in 2023. Now, in 2023, it was observed from record that the little dry season was established in the first decade of the month of August. Now, to give us some context, the little dry season is a phenomenon whereby the rainfall dips over the southwest. We also have a few other characteristics which shows that the little dry season is in place. So in addition to reduced rainfall both in intensity and frequency, we also have cold wind. So it's usually a very cold period where day temperatures, which would normally sit within lower to mid 30s, are now in their mid to upper 20s, thus providing a cold environment. And then the third thing is the fact that it's usually very cloudy. So it's cloudy, but the rains ain't just coming. So now focusing back on the rainfall. So this deep reduction in rainfall shows us eyeball how when this little dry season comes into place, when it gets established. So in 2023, we see that dip in the first decade of August. And for the second and third decade of August, rainfall amount just stayed very low. And then by the first decade of September, we saw rainfall accumulation shoot up. And in that first decade of September was when we had the second peak rainfall for Ikeja in Lagos. Now, Ikeja, Lagos sits in a place where we have a bimodal rainfall distribution. So what that means is that we have the first peak within the month of June, then we have a dip which is characterized by or affected or brought about by the little dry season, and then after that rainfall peaks again, and then we have the second peak which normally comes in the month of September. So that's for 2023. And in 2023, from what we've seen, the little dry season was played out, was a strong event. Now to 2024. In 2024, we see that the dip in rainfall occurred not in August, but this time around in the last decade of July, and played out up to the second decade of August in 2024. So for this year, the little dry season set in a little earlier, 10 days earlier than it did in 2023. Then secondly, we saw that it was also quite strong. So in 2023 and 2024, the little dry season event was actually strong. In 2025, we see a situation whereby the little dry season, by which we recognize by the dip in the rainfall bars, started this time around not in August, not in the third decade of July, but in the second decade of July. So it did come a bit earlier. One other thing we observe here is the fact that it started in the second decade of July. It became very strong in the third decade of July, and then by the first decade of August, we saw that the intensity of the little dry season now reduced slightly. So it played out between July and August. Traditionally, the little dry season occurs between July and August, but more in the month of August, and hence the name that was given to it, the August break. But of course, it does appear also in the month of July. Now for 2025, the little dry season was not as strong, was not as pronounced as what we had in 2024 and what we had in 2023. Now, the next map allows us to see how this played out into 2026. And so this is the second graph. Now, we've already talked about 2023. We've talked about 2024. We've talked about 2025. Now, this is 2026, and this is where we are as at present. Now, in the month of July for 2026, now we are noticing something different from what played out in the 3 other years preceding 2026. And what's that? Is the fact that in the month of July, we had one of the highest rainfall accumulation within a given decade for the first decade of July. In the second decade of July, you still had some good rains playing out in Ikeja, Lagos State. By the third decade of July, we still had some good rains. So in this year 2026, it seems as if the little dry season hasn't really set in. If you see from eyeball from the rainfall distribution, if you just go by rainfall alone, you see that rainfall is still somewhat robust. Now, by the first decade of August, which we just finished, which is shown by this last bar where you have the green, that is where we now see a reduction in accumulated rainfall. So we didn't see that in the first decade of July. We didn't see that in the second decade of July. We didn't see that in the third decade of July, but we did see that in the first decade of August. Now, what's the implication? Now, so far we know, apart from the fact that rainfall is one of the things that points us to the little dry season, we have other indices. So if we go by other indices, we see presently that air temperatures have been quite low. In fact, they've been sitting in the upper 20s from the second decade, around the second decade of July. But even though rains were still somewhat robust compared to the other years, the winds, the cold winds there, and the much cloudiness tells us that something is actually happening. So we see that the little dry season was established between the second decade of July into the third decade of July. However, we observe that it wasn't as strong as what we've had within the previous 3 years. Now, but we'll say, okay, the little dry season plays out in August, and in the first decade of August, we're already seeing a dip in rainfall. So it could be that within the next 2 decades in July, rainfall distribution could still stay very low, and then allowing the little dry season to play out as it traditionally ought to be. Of course, that is a possibility. However, we also know that the forcing functions, what is responsible for our rains, which is the intertropical discontinuity, we already see a situation whereby the intertropical discontinuity is already trying to move southwards. Now, what happens during the little dry season is that the intertropical discontinuity is at its most northward position and just stays there. So while the extreme north receives much rainfall, the south, especially the southwest, has paucity of rains. But we're seeing a slight shift. That's the first thing. The second thing is the fact that it hasn't been as robust as in the other years, and therein is where we talk about variability in climate. Climate does not stay the same all through. We have differences in climate, so the way a climate plays out in 1 year is not exactly how it will play out within the next year. That's the beauty of climate, and that's where we talk about climate variability. But we also see, if we see from 2025 into 2026, we also see something else that seems to be playing out, and it's the fact that the little dry season has not been as strong as it was in 2024 and in 2023. We just have to keep our fingers crossed and see how this year's little dry season plays out, and see how that of 2027 will also play out, to see if there's any iota of climate change also coming to bear here. Also from the temperature side, we've also observed that air temperatures at 850, even though they are low, are not as low as the threshold that literatures have agreed on. So there should be less than 16 degrees Celsius at 850 hectopascal level, but presently we see them just sitting below 17 degrees Celsius. So we just need a little more time to establish if that index has changed to show the establishment of the little dry season, or if it's just a variability in climate. Now, having shown you these graphs, I'll go to the chart to also give you a spatial picture of what is also playing out. Now, this graph is showing us accumulation of rainfall within the last decade of the month of July, as shown from this heading. So this is from 21st into 31st of July 2026. So rainfall distribution is showing us that we're having rains within the neighborhood of around 100 millimeters over the southwest and over that Lagos region. Now let's see how this deviates from what we should get within this period, and the next map gives us that picture. It shows us the anomaly. Now looking at this map, it shows us if rainfall is deviating above what it should be or if it's deviating below what it should be. And this green simply tells you that you still have rains above what they're supposed to be at this climatological period, which agrees with what our graph just showed us, that the little dry season within the month of July for 2026 has not been as strong or not as established as it ought to be like in the other years. Now the next map shows us the same accumulation of rainfall, but this time around for the first decade of August, from 1st to 10th of August. Now for this period, we can see that from the colors that rainfall has reduced somewhat compared to the first map I showed us, which was showing us accumulated rainfall for the last decade of July. And this agrees with the graph I showed earlier, where the dip in the rainfall accumulation was pronounced in the first decade of August, which we've just seen. So we're yet to get the second decade of August. We're still in it. At the end of it, we'll know what is playing out. So we also see that there's a dip. Now let's see how this deviates from what it should be at this time from the next map. So the next map shows us the anomaly. And like the first one we saw that the first one was showing us that there were deviations to the positive. It was green. So we had more rainfall recorded within the last decade of July. But when we come here, we see that there's some little more dryness, as shown by the brown colorations over Lagos axis. We do have some green coloration towards parts of Ekpe, parts of Lekki areas, coloration into Ijebu-Ode and into the southern parts of Ondo State, which shows that rainfall was still somewhat above normal for those areas. But for Ikeja and mainland Lagos into Ogun State, we see, and parts of Oyo, we see that rainfall accumulation was below what it should be within this traditional period. So we've established first and foremost that the little dry season is actually on ground. It's been on ground from somewhere between the second into the third decade of July, though not as strong as it ought to be. We saw that it strengthened slightly in the first decade of August. Is it going to continue? Is it going to further strengthen? Is it going to weaken? Well, we'll wait to see how that will play out. And so for the rest of our forecast period from Thursday into Friday and into Saturday, what are we expecting? It's still the peak rainy season, and we expect rains to be robust. We have moist southwesterly winds just feeding into the country. So we still keep having rains back to back. We are having rains with so much rains, ample amount of rains over the north. We've seen over the central states. We've even seen cases of strong rains with thunder over the southeastern part of the country. So we still expect the rains to hold sway between the rest of Thursday, Friday, and into Saturday. And so if you live anywhere within a flood prone area, you may want to take heed and be careful, be observant, and watch out for forecasts that comes out from the Nigerian Meteorological Agency. And if your drains around you are filled and clogged, you may do yourself some good and your community by endeavoring to ensure that you rid them of the dirt, and that will stop the free flow of runoff surface water. And that's it from here. Thank you for watching. We'll bring you more updates. See you again.